When you sew on a button, you need a couple of things. You need your project that you're going to sew your button on to. You need your button. You need your buttonhole sewn in the piece that is going to button onto your project. And you need your needle with some thread. Remember, any time that you cut a piece of thread, you never want it longer than from your fingertip to your nose. Any longer than that and your thread will tangle and you'll have to cut it off and start again. If you remember when we talked about hand sewing, we said we only wanted one strand of thread to go through the fabric so that the stitches weren't too visible. When you sew on a button, you want two strands of thread because buttons get a little bit extra wear and tear. So they need to be a little bit stronger to hold on. So to make sure we have a double strand of thread, you just have one thread through your needle, but you match up the two ends of thread and tie a knot with both together. So I'm going to tie my knot. Wrap my thread around my finger, twist it off, pinch, and pull. When you are sewing on a button, your knot is going to end up on the right side of the fabric. So you want to make sure you don't have a long thread tail. If you have extra thread past your knot, you want to clip that off with your shears. Now we need to figure out where we are going to put this button on. So I'm going to lay my buttonhole right on top of where I want it to be when the button is buttoned on. And I'm going to pierce my needle down in the middle of the buttonhole. I'm not poking my needle all the way through, it's just kind of poking where I want it. Then I'm going to take my buttonhole away. Make sure you have your buttonhole is open so that you can pull it off. Now you know that is where you want your button to be. When you are sewing a button, you want to make sure that you use very small stitches and they are all in the same spot because all the stitching is on the right side of the fabric. If you look at this button that is already sewn, all the stitching is right here on the right side of the fabric underneath the button. So since all the stitches are really close together in the same spot, you don't see a big mess underneath the button. That is our goal. So I'm going to take a small stitch in that spot and pull my thread tight so that the knot is on the pillow. Now I need to go through the holes of my button. There are two kinds of buttons. There are buttons that have holes in them, whether it's 2 holes or 4 holes. And there are buttons that have no holes on the top, but a little hook or loop on the bottom. That hook or loop is called a shank. Every button needs a shank. The shank is the space between the button and the fabric that gives your buttonhole piece space to be buttoned on. If you notice, my button is not flat against the fabric. There's a little column of thread, which is a thread shank, underneath the button that gives this piece of fabric enough room to be buttoned on. Since the button I am buttoning on has holes in it, I need to create a thread shank. So I'm going to go from the bottom of the button up through one of the holes and down through another of the holes. And then I'm going to take another stitch, and again, every stitch you take for the button will be in the same spot on your project. I'm going to pull this pretty tight, but I'm not going to pull the button flat against the fabric. I want there to be a little bit of space underneath the button, between the button and my project. That will give me room for the shank. The amount of space that you leave depends on the thickness of the fabric that you are going to button on. So my fabric's about 1/16 of an inch thick, so I want my shank to be about 1/16 of an inch long. I don't want to leave a lot of space so that my button is flopping and loose on the project. So I'm just going to pull it so I have a little bit of space underneath. Going once through the button is not going to securely hold it in place. So I'm going to go through the same set of holes. Up and down. And after I go through the holes in the button, I'm taking another stitch in my project, again in the same spot as all the other stitches have been. And pull it tight, but not so tight that the button is flat against the fabric. To securely attach a button, you need to go through each set of holes 3 to 4 times. So I will go up and back down through the same set of holes. And after I go through the holes, I take a stitch in my fabric to secure it. Okay. You want to make sure that you have your button held firmly when you do this. Otherwise you'll end up with loops on top of the button because sometimes you pulled it tighter than other times. So hold your button the same distance away from the fabric after every stitch. Now, since my button has 4 holes instead of 2, I need to go through the other 2 holes. So I'm going to go from the underneath side of the button up and back down through the other hole. And then take a stitch. I'm going to do that a total of 3 times. So 2 more times through that set of holes. Up, down, stitch. Up, down, and on the last time you go through the second set of holes, you're not going to take a stitch. You want your thread coming from right underneath the button. Now we need to finish off the shank. Remember the shank? That's the part that's the thread column that I made that keeps the button off the fabric a little bit so that my piece that has the buttonhole on it has space to lay smooth underneath the button. Right now there's just a bunch of threads underneath there. I want to combine them in a tight column. To do that, I am going to do several blanket stitches. To make a blanket stitch, you wrap your thread in a circle around the button and then stick your needle through the circle and pull it tight. Pull it up and tight. That's going to create a little knot right underneath the button. And I'm going to do that 4 or 5 times, and every time I do that, the blanket stitch is stacking right underneath the one above it. One more. Okay, you just keep doing it until you get down to the fabric. Last thing I need to do is tie the knot so that the button doesn't fall off. So I'm going to tie it off just like I tie off any hand stitching. Take a tiny stitch, pull it tight, take one more tiny stitch in the same spot, and this time before I pull it all the way tight, I'm going to pull it just so I have a loop. And I'm going to go through that loop 3 times. 1, 2, 3, and then pull it tight. Now I have a knot. If I clip off my thread right at the base of the knot, right next to the knot, then the knot could wiggle free over time, and then my button would start to fall off. So to prevent the knot from coming undone, I need to leave a thread tail, but I don't want to see that thread tail on the outside of my project, so I'm going to hide it. It's called burying the thread tail. So I'm going to stick my needle into my project right by the knot, and then out of my project away from the knot. That way I'll clip it off here and my thread tail is hidden inside my project.